Welcome to Channel's Business Globe with me, Juliana Oinka, from our studios here in London. Coming up on today's show, the British Chancellor of the Exchequer, Rachel Reeves, has delivered a bold fiscal plan with £40 billion in tax hikes targeting high earners, businesses and capital gains. This historic budget includes a major boost for the NHS, billions for housing and education, and a significant rise in employer national insurance contributions. Inheritance tax, air passenger duty and even tobacco and soft drink levies are seeing hikes, signalling a strong push for funding public services and infrastructure. Critics warn of potential impacts on business growth, while supporters see it as a necessary step toward economic recovery. On today's show, I'll be breaking down the Labour Party's ambitious spend to grow strategy with our Downing Street correspondent Simon Pusey, former Minister of State for Europe Dennis MacShane, and Professor Prem, a sitting member of the UK House of Lords. Later in the show, personal development coach Toyib Adewale Adelodun will talk to me about how the budget will impact Nigerians living, studying and working in the UK. Chancellor Rachel Reeves defended her decision to introduce £40 billion in tax increases as part of the latest UK budget, asserting that the measures are crucial for meeting the country's funding needs and addressing a significant fiscal deficit. Reeves emphasised that increasing public service spending requires careful financial backing, framing her budget as a commitment to fiscal responsibility and long-term economic stability. We need to ensure that the cost of these critical investments are covered, Reeves has said, pointing to the budget's aim to support working families through popular initiatives such as raising the minimum wage and allowing universal credit recipients to retain more of their earnings. She expressed pride in her ability to include these provisions, underscoring their role in supporting low-income households. The Chancellor also called attention to a £22 billion fiscal shortfall, which she attributed to mismanagement by the previous Conservative government. Reeves argued that while the current budget prioritises families and economic support, restoring the nation's financial health requires addressing this substantial deficit. Major announcements in the UK budget include several impactful changes and investments. Starting with capital gains tax, rates have now been raised to 18% for the lower band and 24% for the higher band, with no change to rates for residential property. Next, we see a significant shift in employer national insurance. Beginning April 2025, employers will pay 15% more on salaries over £5,000. The inheritance tax threshold remains frozen until 2030, with pensions and AIM shares now included as part of estate calculations. Moving to property, there's an increase in the stamp duty surcharge on second homes, which rises from 3% to 5%. On the investment front, the government has earmarked substantial funding for public services, with £5 billion allocated to housing and additional significant investments in transport, healthcare and defence. Finally, targeted support has been directed to key industries, with £1 billion allocated for aerospace and £2 billion for the automotive sector, aimed at driving growth and innovation in these areas. Well, for more on this, I was earlier joined in the studio by our business correspondent, Simon Pusey. Simon, so the budget has dominated headlines, not just this week, but of course before that, because it had all been briefed to the media. The Speaker of the House, Sir Lindsay Hoyle, not happy with Rachel Reeves at all. Really difficult to see if there are any winners, surprisingly, although, of course, we know the national minimum wage will be hiked. But apart from that, I haven't seen anybody giving any flowers to Rachel Reeves. Can you talk to me about some of the big announcements and who are the actual winners and losers from this significant fiscal announcement?
Yeah, it's also significant, isn't it, because it's the first time a woman has been Chancellor and has announced a budget in this way. It has been massively overhyped.
Yeah.
I think because they knew that it was going to be so controversial with the tax increases after they said there weren't going to be any tax increases when they were elected. So that we'll come on to that. In terms of winners and losers, I think it's one of these where you have to wait and see, which sounds like a kind of get out of jail thing for us as journalists to say, oh, we don't actually know. But
we don't.
She's looking for growth, right? She's talking about growth. And so we have to wait and see whether that works. but it is a big gamble because £40 billion in spending and in tax hikes, when she hasn't put that in her manifesto, and you've had Rishi Sunak got up immediately after and said, you've lied to the British public, you've deceived them, you said at the election that you weren't going to increase taxes, and you have massively. Let's just start. The International Monetary Fund has welcomed the measures announced by Rachel Reeves. That is quite a rare moment for what is an influential and supposedly impartial financial watchdog. So that's a big boost for her.
Yeah, that's a plus.
That, and they say they're backing the increase in investment and spending on urgent public services, as well as sustainable tax rises, is what they say. I think the main criticism has been around the national insurance hike, which she admits will hit people in their pay packets.
Businesses.
And especially when you're talking about growth, it's quite hard to square that circle, because employers are going to bear the brunt of this, and then it's going to be passed on to employees. And that doesn't sound like it's going to encourage growth.
No.
That you're going to hit them there, because she wants small and medium-sized businesses to flourish within the UK, and that is going to do the opposite, really. The Prime Minister criticising broken promises, saying little of what Rachel Reeves announced was in the manifesto. She says, well, you left a 20 billion black hole, which
Jeremy Hunt denies.
They deny. So it's a hard one to sort of look at. I think you do need to look at it years down the line. Is this going to encourage growth? There is also the whole issue of Brexit in the background, which isn't really mentioned because people are scared to mention it because so many people voted for Brexit. But it's quite hard to deny that that is something that's probably flatlined things, and we don't have our biggest trading partner like we did. So people always talking about 1993. That's the last time we had tax hikes of this nature. But we had a much better economy then because we had a huge trading partner on our doorstep, which we no longer have, and we're trying to sort of play catch up with that.
Geopolitics also not as fragmented.
No, exactly, yes. So I think it's hard to find the winners and losers in this. Well, you can obviously find the losers because a lot of people will have higher taxes.
Private school VAT. I know a lot of our viewers in Nigeria won't be happy about that, especially if they've got children, 3 or 4 children in private schools across England.
And this is why she leaked what she did, and that we knew about that for a long time, didn't we? Because there would be the markets would go absolutely crazy if she unloaded all of this at once. I think the VAT on private schools is one that's, if you don't have children in private schools and you hear that they're not paying tax, the wealthiest are not paying tax, then it's quite a hard one. And also when you're doing things of the nature that she is, then to leave that out would be quite tough. But
what about the NHS? Got to talk about that, because it seems to be a win for the NHS, although I don't think we haven't heard officially from them.
Well, it's a lot of extra money, isn't it?
Yes.
I think a lot of people would say this is kind of like a black hole that you throw money into, and it never seems to get better. So it almost needs a root and branch reformation in some ways, the NHS, or needs to modernise massively. You can't just keep increasing the amount of money you're putting into it. But it is obviously a very important thing for Labour, who created the NHS, and it's such an important institution.
For all of us.
Yeah, exactly. So I think it's important that obviously it gets the funding it deserves. But that is, you're right, one of the things that has got a lot of money. I think things like teachers and schools haven't got as much money as they were hoping for.
Although they got the pay increase.
They've got a pay increase, but they're, generally across the board, the public sector, the NHS may have got a lot of money, but the public sector is much bigger than just the NHS. You've got social care that you need to worry about as well. So there's so much going on. And I don't think, given the state of the economy that we knew was in, I don't think Rachel Reeves was ever going to come out as like a victor with this. I think it does just depend on the next few months and years as to how the markets and how growth goes and how the economy fares under what has been a very overhyped or a very hyped up budget, and it'll be interesting to see how it goes down in the long term.
What's the mood music on the ground? How are people, normal people like us, coping with it? Do people care? Do you think people really paid attention, or are they all focused on the election across the pond? I think
more than ever this budget has been focused on by people because we've heard so much about it. We've heard lots of leaks and briefings about it.
Yes.
And I think people were quite worried ahead of this because so many times we've heard it's not going to be easy. The Tories have left us in this terrible state. So I think people were actually quite anxious about this. And I think it could have been worse on many fronts. There were a lot of things that didn't happen that we thought might. Usually budgets are boring. Budgets are for people who read the Financial Times and people who are experts and people who have money involved in it. I think for the ordinary people, usually they don't care, and that's been what's been distinctive here. Not only Rachel Reeves, the first female chancellor, to produce a budget like this, but also the fact that people are talking about it and it has been hyped up for months now. But you're right, the US election probably pulling a little bit, and when we're talking about the economy and markets and financial, the US election is probably going to be quite high up in terms
I think so.
With wars as well. So it's quite a hard job, isn't it, for Rachel Reeves to talk about various things, and then it could be all blown out of the water if Donald Trump gets in a couple of weeks' time.
Yeah, exactly. I suppose we'll be talking about that this time next week. Thank you so much, Simon.
Thank you.
The budget talk continues with experts and policymakers weighing in on how these measures will shape the UK's economic future. I was earlier joined in the studio by the former British Minister of State for Europe, Dennis MacShane. Dennis, it was a big fiscal event. Of course, the British media have been harping on about this for weeks and weeks and months, and I think we've still got weeks to assess it. But before we go into the detail, could you just give me your broad assessment on Rachel Reeves' statement, whether or not the British public can trust the Labour Party, given that what was in it, they promised wouldn't be in it, which is £40 billion in tax rises?
No, let's be very, very clear. I've read the manifesto carefully. The only promises were that on tax, that there'd be no new income tax rise. That hasn't happened. No increase in social security, what we call national insurance contributions on employees, on workers. That hasn't happened. And there'll be no increase in VAT. Those promises have been kept.
Different words.
So not at all. I mean, you don't... if you listen to Sir Keir, and you've had him on the programme, and other Labour people for the last year, 2 years, all they've said is Britain is broken, we have to repair it. The policies that were been applied by the last government led to the biggest increase in mortgages, biggest increase in unemployment, and a big drop in growth. We are the repair team. Do you know something? When a repair team arrives on the scene, they've got to have the tools and the kit that's been paid for to do the job. And this budget, I think, look, in a year's time, 2 years' time, I think kind of asking, all the commentators on television the last few days on the budget. Do you want me to give you a good commentary who's going to win the Premier League next year? No, you just tell me to get off out of here.
Yeah.
And yet these guys that women are listened to as if they were gurus, they don't know nothing. They're nice people, they're lovely people, they're friends of mine, they're much cleverer on economics than I am. But honestly, the proof of the pudding will be in the eating. We know the International Monetary Fund, which normally loves wrapping people across the knuckles, has welcomed this budget and said it's a good one.
They've been asking for investment in public sector for years, haven't they?
So, I mean, we can go there. Others, on the left will say, it's not socialist enough. And on the business right will say, how dare you make business pay a bit more money? We want to go back to Liz Truss. I heard a chap on the BBC this morning who's Sir Nigel somebody or other. I checked him up. He was the biggest supporter of Brexit in the city, and Brexit has cost the British economy a lot of money. And he was a great, enthusiastic supporter of Liz Truss. Now, I'm sure...
Well, there were a few people that were supportive of Liz Truss's budget.
I'm sure in his city career, he made lots of money for his firm and treated employees well. I'm not dissing him in any way. But a man who backed Brexit and defended and promoted Liz Truss, I wouldn't put him on Radio 4.
I totally agree with you, Dennis, although, I think the public would say, can we even trust the politicians? Can we even trust the Prime Minister?
We will wait and see.
We shall wait and see. Thank you so much, Dennis MacShane, the former British Minister of State for Europe for the Labour Party. Thank you so much for your time and expertise, as always, Dennis.
Thank you.
Thank you. Coming up on Channel's Business Global, I'll be speaking with Professor Prem, a sitting member of the UK House of Lords, as we dive into the Labour Party's ambitious spend to growth strategy and its potential ripple effects on business and economic recovery. Later, I'll be joined by personal development coach Toyib Adewale Adelodun, who will share insights on how these budget changes might impact Nigerians living, studying and working here in the UK. All of this after the break. Do stay with us. Welcome back to Channel's Business Global with me, Juliana Oinka, from our studios here in London. In light of the UK's recent budget, which introduces significant tax hikes, new fees and a boost in public spending, many Nigerians living, studying and working in the UK are wondering how these changes will affect their personal finances, living costs and overall economic security. To help unpack what this all means, I was earlier joined in the studio by personal development coach Toyib Adewale Adelodun, who shared practical advice on managing finances under these new conditions. Toyib Adewale Adelodun, thank you so much for taking time out to join me here in the studio. Of course, the budget has been a massive topic of conversation this week. Not just this week, it was so brief.
Build up to it.
There was a huge build-up, but it was a big fiscal moment, not only because Chancellor Rachel Reeves, first woman in 800 years to deliver the budget.
Yes.
It also affects all of us. I know you've been following it keenly. Before we dive into the detail, can you give me your broad overall perspective? Do you think we're better off or worse off after Wednesday's statement?
Like you said, the Rachel Reeves, the first woman to deliver, that's a huge thing.
Yes.
And there was a thing that she started with where she said, for you girls out there, there's no limit to your dreams.
Absolutely.
That was motivational.
Yeah.
And I felt that, like, every girl should listen to this. And then you have to look at the build-up, as you said, towards the budget. The Conservative Party were saying the build-up was too much in terms of, like, it was reduced.
A lot of warnings.
A lot of warnings, you know. And some bits were already coming out.
Yeah.
Like the winter fuel payments.
Yes.
Like the
VAT.
bus pass, the VAT.
On private schools.
You know, so those things were already coming out. So there was a build-up to it that it would be massive. And when Rachel went ahead, I think people were expecting about 35 billion pounds to be raised, and then she said 40 billion.
Goodness.
And I could see someone on the other side of the parliament like, 40 billion, where would that come from? So one of the reasons that government is the way it is because they have to fund whatever program they have. And
that's the reality.
That's the reality. So whatever you do is the opportunity cost. If you do something, you're going to miss out on something.
Yeah.
So whatever you do...
The compromise.
Yeah, whatever you say yes to, you're saying no to something else.
Was the compromise carefully curated? Because the big issue now is people say, we can't trust you. You promised us throughout the campaign, throughout that historic victory, that you wouldn't harm working people.
Right.
And he seems to have done just that. Like
you said, it's the compromise. Whatever you say yes to, you say no to something else. So I think they were quite careful with the wording here. And that's why the electorate should always pay attention to politicians. Like they said, we will not increase the tax on the working people. Now, majority of the 40 billion, which is about 25 billion, will be raised from businesses.
Yes.
Paying the employer's national insurance.
Yeah.
So if you're not...
Is that not going to be passed down?
Exactly. Because it's all about the bottom line for the businesses. If they are paying more to keep their staff, the staff better be well behaved.
You've actually raised a good point as well, because I know, of course, a lot of our viewers may know you from social media. You're really popular on there, giving advice, career, professional advice. Talk about this employer's national insurance.
Yes.
Is this going to impact those who are being sponsored to work in the UK? I'm sure you're going to get a load of questions about that, Toyib.
So this is the part where international students, people that are being sponsored, need to be really, really aware in terms of opportunities that are available. Employers will be looking to cut their cost of running business. So they may not hire as they used to, number one. And if they are sponsoring you, they are already paying some money to acquire the sponsorship license. They are paying some fees to do that. So
and now this is an additional...
This is an additional. So if you are looking for sponsorship job, this is a time when you need to be really, really aware.
Especially because I'm sure it's April, perhaps, that this will kick in. So there's a few months now to really fast track.
In those areas. So if you see an offer now, I will urge you not to be too picky.
Yeah.
You know, if an employer is willing to taking you on now, don't say I'm waiting for something else. Because people are sitting down crunching numbers now and saying, do we need more staff? Do we need to sponsor someone? You know, and you know you already fall into the second or third tier in terms of the hiring rules already. Now they have a bill to deal with. Will they be able to take you on?
It's a really important point. So many important points. I also want to touch on some of the positives. I know there are very few positives, but there are some.
Yes.
One of them being the billions that is going to be plummeted into the NHS. We know that, Nigerians contribute so much to the NHS.
Yes.
It's not just caring, although caring is obviously important.
It's a huge one.
We are also doctors.
Yes.
How is that going to benefit us? Do you think there could potentially be more opportunities if there are now going to be 40,000 more appointments every week? Surely they need more staff.
100%. NHS is huge. NHS is something the whole of Britain is proud of.
Yes.
And it is saddening to see the challenges it's had since COVID and all of that. So pumping that money in will really, really help.
Yes.
But there is also something about the reform, because sometimes they say throwing money at the problem is not actually going to solve the problem. So there will be some reforms that will have to happen in terms of how things are being done, and definitely that will create opportunities as well, because NHS is arguably one of the biggest employers.
I think it is the biggest employer in the
country.
UK.
The funding in the affordable housing budget and the £500 million for potholes and all of those things they want to do, that is construction. I talk about that a lot. That's some jobs in some areas. The funding they are trying to put in HS2, that is jobs.
Yes.
So it's a bit of a compromise. You have to raise the tax. It will have its downsides and it will have its upsides as well. You can't get 100% in the budget, but here we are.
Here we are, and as they've said, we're going to be talking about this for weeks, months, years.
For months.
Or, depending on what happens on Tuesday, across the pond.
Across the pond.
That may shape the discourse of geopolitics. But for now, we're still dissecting the budget. Really interesting, as always, talking to you with your expert advice, Mr. Toyib Adewale Adelodun, who is, of course, an engineer, but doubles up as a personal development coach, particularly for Nigerians in the UK and abroad. Thank you so much, Toyib.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you.
Well, for a final assessment on the budget, I'm glad to be joined by Professor Prem, a sitting member of the UK House of Lords. Professor Prem, thank you so much for taking time out to dissect the budget. A budget in a generation is what the media pundits in the UK are describing it as. A focus on £40 billion of tax rises, including capital gains and private school fees, and the potential impact of growth versus funding public services. Can you talk to me about how this is going to impact economic growth?
Well, I think you have to bear in mind the government's main goal is to build a sustainable economy and secure growth. That really requires investment in infrastructure, requires that people have enough purchasing power, and that can't be done without reducing income and wealth inequalities. So when we look on the investment side, the government is going to borrow around £100 billion over the next 5 years to invest in new industries and also the infrastructure. But the difficulty there is that it is reviving what we call the private finance initiative, which is persuading private sector to invest in the public infrastructure. And last time we did that, for every £1 of private investment, the government repaid £6. That then, in a sense, handicaps the future generations and the future budgets. So the government is embarked on that particular path, and I don't think that is really a good idea. On the other hand, any investment is welcome, but I think the government has far more room to maneuver to invest in the infrastructure than it is actually using.
What do you think are the other benefits, the winners and the losers, apart from 1 penny off a pint?
Well, I think the biggest winners are actually the rich. For example, the government has backed off the fundamental reform of the way so-called carried interest on private equity is taxed. It is saying that their managers will be taxed at 32% maximum. Now, if you compare that to a banker who gets a bonus, that banker will be paying top rate of 47%. So the private equity managers have been let off. There is no full alignment between the taxation of capital gains and dividends with the taxation of wages. So wages are still taxed at a much higher rate than the return on wealth, which is what capital gains and dividends are.
Professor Prem, thank you so much for your expertise. It's been described as a budget for generations, so I think we're going to be dissecting it certainly for the weeks and months to come. I don't think the Office for Budget Responsibility expects the real effect of this budget to be felt for a number of years. But it's been fascinating listening to you, Professor Prem, of course, as a member of the UK House of Lords. Thank you so much. Well, sadly, that's all we have time for today. But as always, do get in touch with your comments and suggestions. I'll see you at the same time next week for more in-depth business analysis on Channel's Business Global. Goodbye.